Washington keeps repeating one explosive claim. We need to punish Canada with tariffs because fentanyl is coming across our northern border. It sounds urgent and sounds terrifying, and it suggests Canada bears responsibility for America's opioid crisis. There's just one problem. The United States government's own data shows the northern border accounts for just 0.2% of fentanyl seizures. Not 20, not 2, 0.2. In this video, we're going to look at the numbers, the supply chains, and the political incentives behind this narrative because it directly impacts Canada's economy, sovereignty, and bargaining power. Welcome to North of MAGA. I'm your host, Pierre Shields. Let's look at the facts. I thought it was brilliant. So what I did is I went into the comments and I figured, hey, I'm going to mention people's names and say, hey, love your channel, love this, love that. Oh, it's awesome. So I did a search in the comments for love. And then I realized love was like, love the F-35, love the Gripen, love the, so brilliant, not so brilliant. But I want to do a quick shout out. So I'm using old technology here for the youngsters watching. This is paper made from wood. So shout out to Left Seat. Oh yeah, and also I don't want to call out anybody's real names because I have trolls and there's some crazy people out there. There really are. So I'm trying to just say hi, but not be too obvious with who I'm talking about. So thanks to Left Seat, Katja, James DJ Brown, Liz Rock, Mr. Hellstrom, Mr. Brock, Mr. Johansson. A lot of misters, I'm sorry, but that's what it is. Also, Mr. Marwell, Mr. Kenway, and Mrs. McNabb from Down Under. Love to the Australian fans that are watching. It's absolutely fantastic to hear from you. Oh, and some misses. So Mrs. Fish, Mrs. Horton, Mrs. Fonseca. Thank you so much for your kind comments, your encouragement. This is really great. If you want to help me out and help support the channel, please subscribe, like if you like this video, and share. It really helps me out. I want to be able to spend as much time doing this as I possibly can. Okay, I'm going in the teleprompter now, so I'm going in the teleprompter now. That'll probably slow things down a tad. It's hard not to get excited. Why this matters. This matters because the fentanyl talking point isn't just rhetoric. It's being used to justify tariffs, trade penalties, emergency powers, and potential violations of international agreements. The problem is simple. Americans are being told a story about Canada that isn't supported by evidence. This narrative makes it seem like Canada is a major contributor to US fentanyl supply, when in reality, the flow across our border is so statistically small, it barely registers. If Canadians don't confront this misframing, Canada becomes a convenient scapegoat every time Washington needs to look tough without making difficult decisions. Most export countries are held accountable based on real data. Canada is being pressured over 0.2%, a number so tiny it wouldn't justify a single policy change in most countries. If nothing changes, the United States will continue using Canada as the low-risk target whenever domestic politics demand a villain. We need to stand up. We need to stand up now. Structural context. To understand how absurd this narrative is, we need to look at how the fentanyl system works, not how it's described in White House press conferences. Every major US federal investigation points to the same structure. Chemical precursors are manufactured in China. These are legal or semi-legal chemicals that once combined produce fentanyl. They're shipped globally, but cartels in Mexico remain the key recipients. Cartel superlabs in Mexico manufacture fentanyl at industrial scale. These aren't small operations. They're multi-building compounds with sophisticated equipment, production targets, and internal logistics. Smuggling is conducted directly across the southern US border. Traffickers don't ship product into Canada and then loop it south again. That'd be crazy, it'd be ridiculous. And it would increase risk, cost, and logistics problems for no benefit. Distribution networks inside the United States move product into cities. That's where the domestic part of the crisis takes over. Canada isn't part of this chain. There are no cartel superlabs here. Canada doesn't produce fentanyl for export. Canada isn't a central transit hub. So who benefits when Washington suggests otherwise? Politicians. Politicians who need a simple explanation for a complex crisis. Numbers don't lie, politicians do. It fits again. And who pays the price? Canada's economy, Canada's reputation, and Canada's negotiating leverage. Maybe not so much reputation, because anybody outside of America who's listening to what's being said by the White House knows it's just not right. It just doesn't make any sense. So let's be honest, if 99.8% of fentanyl enters the US somewhere else, targeting Canada doesn't solve anything, but it does score political points. It scores political points with the uninformed. What was the orange guy's statement? He loves the uneducated. The data Washington doesn't talk about. Let's break down the numbers that undermine the entire narrative. According to US Customs and Border Protection, US Customs and Border Protection, between October 2023 and September 2024, 19.5 kilograms of fentanyl were seized along the entire Canada-US border. That's 42 pounds from my American friends. Approximately 9,600 kilograms were seized along the Mexico-US border. That's 21,000 pounds in freedom units. That's an astonishing difference. It's not a small discrepancy. Nearly the entirety of fentanyl comes from Mexico. Put simply, for every 1 kilogram linked to Canada, roughly 500 kilograms come across the southern border. I didn't convert to freedom units. And remember, seizures are not total inflow. They represent the fraction of smuggled goods that law enforcement manages to intercept. If seizures at the southern border are really high, the true inflow is far, far higher. So let's ask a basic question any policy analyst would ask. Why would traffickers send products north into Canada only to smuggle it back south again? There's no cartel advantage in that route. The risk increases, the costs increase, the timeline increases, the smuggling complexity increases. Every observable incentive pushes traffickers away from the northern border and towards the southern one, where the geography, population density, corruption opportunities, and infrastructure make crossing easier. Even Canadian law enforcement agencies openly state the same thing. Canada's fentanyl crisis is domestic, not an export industry. But here's what makes the narrative even weaker. The northern border is nearly 9,000 kilometers long, 5,600 miles, the longest undefended border in the world. If traffickers wanted to exploit a weak point, they could, but they don't because the route makes no sense. The real supply chain and why it's avoided. Following the evidence leads to the same conclusion every time. China provides precursor chemicals, Mexico produces the finished product, and the United States receives the bulk of it through the southern border. That's the entire core supply chain. But addressing that reality is politically difficult in Washington. Why? Number one, calling out China requires diplomatic confrontation and economic consequences. Number two, confronting Mexican cartels requires large-scale law enforcement coordination and border reforms. Number three, every Republican is afraid of the orange guy. Number four, acknowledging domestic demand requires acknowledging domestic policy failures and acknowledging the lies. Blaming Canada avoids all of that. There's also a major misconception in the American public. When people hear border issues, they instinctively picture the northern border, the symbolic long frontier with Canada. But the real numbers shatter that image, 99.8% versus 0.2%. You can't dumb it down anymore. The conversation isn't about geography, it's about politics, choosing the more convenient border to focus on. This is why public opinion matters. Once Americans see the actual figures, the narrative falls apart instantly, and the scapegoating becomes harder to justify. Maybe not MAGA. It's such a cult. What's this all really about? The fentanyl narrative isn't really about drugs, it's about tariffs, leverage, optics, and power. Canada is a perfect geopolitical punching bag. We're peaceful, we're cooperative, we don't retaliate aggressively, and we're deeply tied to the US economy. And we don't cost political capital to target. Blaming China risks diplomatic fallout. Blaming Mexico risks regional consequences. Blaming cartels requires long-term strategy. Blaming Canada costs nothing and gets headlines. So instead of focusing on precursor chemicals and cartel logistics, border security, or treatment programs, Washington chooses the simplest path. Point at the quiet neighbor and say, they did it. This isn't just misguided, it's dishonest strategic misdirection. And here's why it's dangerous. If a government is willing to use a false narrative about fentanyl to justify tariffs, what else might they justify with data that doesn't hold up? Canada doesn't just need to defend itself now. It needs to prevent this tactic from becoming the norm. The facts. When you put all this together, the picture is crystal clear. Canada isn't the source of the crisis. The data doesn't support the narrative. The supply chain bypasses Canada almost entirely. The political incentives drive Washington's messaging, not the numbers. And Canadian economic stability becomes collateral damage. But there's a deeper transformation here. This is so enraging, though. Canada doesn't have to accept this framing. We can challenge false premises, use data to correct the record, and show that sovereignty isn't just military. It's informational, it's economic, it's the ability to say, no, that's not true, even when a superpower says it is. This isn't about left or right. It isn't about ideology. It's about truth versus convenience, and about an independent country refusing to be used as a political shield. Conclusion. Here's the takeaway in one sentence. The fentanyl debate isn't about security. It's about power, economics, and a narrative that falls apart the moment you look at data. So here's my question to you. Do you think Washington is misinformed or deliberately shifting blame? Again, I'm pretty sure I know what the answer is going to be. And if you want more clear, fact-driven Canadian analysis without the hit like and subscribe. It really helps me. Also, if you could share this video with someone who needs to hear the facts and wake up to the threat from the White House, I think we'd all be better off. Hi, it's future me from editing. I gotta show you two of the cutest things in the world. First of all, this is Puppy. Look at the camera, Puppy. So sweet. She's such a good girl. She ate some spaghetti though, so she got a little bit kiss. Second thing I want to show you. Are these not the cutest things you have ever seen? Seriously, the cutest things ever. Okay, I gotta let you go now. Bye. Thanks for spending time with me. This has been Pierre Shields for North of MAGA. Go play outside.